Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome today to a joint presentation by the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria and the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. To talk or not to talk, that is the question, a webinar on difficult conversations. I am Alicia Ashcroft and I'm a project officer at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. Now to our panel of experts. We have with us today David Leonard, the Manager of Community Engagement at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. Anita DeBlasio, the Peacemaking Program Manager at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, and Sara, Reid, the Manager of the Hume region for Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. I'll now hand over to David.
Thank you, Alicia. When I was looking at our topic today, I was reminded of a quote by a podcast called Tim Ferriss, who said that a person's success in life can be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations he or she is willing to have. And at the moment, with return to COVID normal, there's more than ample opportunity for us to all be successful. There's the challenges of vaccination or not vaccination. There's the questions about should I return to work? There's unfinished business we might have with our neighbours. So our panel today has many years of experience in coaching people through difficult conversations. I myself have worked at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria, which provides a free mediation centre through the Department of Justice. Been there for 25 years as a caseworker, as a trainer, as a mediator, and now I do community engagement. And with me is my colleague, Sara Reid.
Hi, Dave. Hello to everybody. So my name's Sara Reid. I'm the Regional Manager for the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria in the Hume region, which is in the northeast of Victoria. I've worked as a mediator with the Dispute Settlement Centre for over 10 years. Prior to that, I worked as a conciliator with Consumer Affairs and also as a solicitor in private practice for more than 20 years. So I've had a bit of experience with difficult conversations.
Fantastic. And now from our sister agency in the Department of Justice, Neighbourhood Justice Centre, Anita.
Oh, thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. As Alicia said, I'm the Peacemaking Program Manager at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre in Collingwood, which is a part of Victoria in case there's anyone from overseas zooming in today. Peacemaking is a service which brings together people who have been affected by conflict or crime. So it's very much that having those difficult, uncomfortable conversations. Yes, me too. I've been in this sector for a number of years. I became a mediator in 2001 and have worked in the sector since then. I've trained mediators. I've worked as a conciliator in the domestic building sector, and I manage the mediation services the mediation program at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre for the Dispute Settlement Centre a number of years ago.
Okay, so what we're planning to do today, Anita, Sara, and myself, is to have a bit of a discussion about discussion. So it won't be a provision of legal advice, and it won't be a discussion about to give you the killer arguments about how to win the vaccination or work from home debate, but more about the techniques and methods that work effectively in mediation where people and peacemaking, where people have difficult conversations. So I should probably start by saying, well, what are we actually talking about here when we mean a difficult conversation? Anita.
Well, look, I think what we're talking about today is real-time discussions that can happen face-to-face online, especially we've done that during COVID, and perhaps over the phone, and they're those discussions that we often shy away from and that make us feel uncomfortable, where there are strong differences of opinion and have the potential perhaps to become emotional. And the examples you gave, it's usually a negotiation discussion rather than a delivery of bad news discussion like terminating someone's employment or having that difficult discussion about poor employee performance. That's what we're going to be focusing on today.
Okay. I mean, so Sarah, when I say difficult, what is the things that make these conversations so difficult or challenging, uncomfortable?
I guess there's quite a lot of possible reasons that make things difficult. Probably top of the list in my experience is a discussion that involves emotions or feelings. So whether that's shame, anger, embarrassment, frustration, any sorts of feelings that are involved there make the conversation quite difficult. And the feelings might be triggered by the situation or the subject matter themselves. So you might look at a situation, say you had some siblings who were going to divide up some bits of personal property in an estate matter. Some of the parties might feel very strongly about particular pieces. I really want that vase because that's the one I remember that grandma, used to have on the mantelpiece. It really means a lot to me. Sometimes it might arise from the people who are involved. So it might be, there's grief going on for the loss of the person who's deceased. It might be there's a whole history of rivalry or feelings between you and your siblings that are coming up because of this experience. It might be that you've had difficult experiences in the past where people have become emotional and this is triggering for you. So there's quite a lot of issues that could arise out of feelings and emotions. You might be worried about you getting emotional. If I get emotional, will they think I'm weak? Will I be able to hold it together? Will I look like I don't know what I'm doing? You might be worried about them getting emotional. What if they start crying? This is important to me. I don't want to give in just because I feel sorry for them. How am I going to hold my own in that situation? There might also be some concern about communication styles. So the other person might have a particularly assertive style and you've got a less assertive style and you're worried again about holding your own or handle it. You're worried about an experience where they've talked over you in the past and you're thinking, how am I going to manage if that starts to happen this time? There might also be different values. So each of you might have very different values on a particular thing. And David will talk a bit more about that in detail, but it is quite a difficult issue to have a discussion where people have very different values. There might also be a power imbalance. So you can think of a classic one, I suppose, of the employer and the employee. You're having a discussion, trying to treat it as discussion between equals, but the truth is your employer probably has a fair bit of power. It might be a more community situation. So a young person trying to talk to a police officer, there's an imbalance of power there. And there's also issues in terms of the information that might be available to each party. So for example, if you go to the conversation perhaps about vaccination, you might have concerns about where people are getting their information from. So how are you going to resolve this if I'm getting my advice from my best friends and the people at the pub and the other person's getting their advice from somewhere else? So what information is available and how are you going to sort it out if everyone's getting their advice differently?
Yeah, there's nothing worse, more frustrating than discussing with someone about a fence and they think, well, I can just take it to court and I'll win. And you think, where did you find that out? So, Anita, what are the risks involved? I mean, it sounds like a lot of the reluctance that people have is because there is risk involved. This is why it's challenging.
Yeah, look, we tend to avoid them or find them daunting because there is a fear of the possible consequences. And a big one around that is not wanting to damage or lose the relationship. There's shame and embarrassment about what's happened, and it might be around what part we've played in the situation. And I look at it this way also. I think every time you step into a difficult conversation, vulnerability plays a really big role. Vulnerability is uncertainty, it's risk and emotional exposure. This is what makes conversations difficult and causes people to delay having them.
Right. So it's not just about maybe worried about the reaction of the other person, but it's also worried about your own sense of feelings and identity that could be at risk too. You could be challenged by what the other person says.
Definitely.
Maybe if we could flip to our first slide. There's an interesting little illustration here that from Harvard, that conflict can occur in 3 different layers, and these layers could be separate or they could be on top of each other depending on the issue and who you're talking to. So at one layer, you might have a conflict that's just about task and resources. So you might have two people who are just simply negotiating over sale of some goods, and there's a question about we're haggling over the price, or you're working with a family member and it's about how much time can each person spend on a particular task. Then there's conflict at the relationship level. So that's where the challenge to the people involved in the conflict is then their deeper feelings of need and their relationship. And then the third level is more about identity and values-based discussions. In a task or resource-based discussion, if we were talking about, say, a fence, where you'd asked your neighbour to repair a fence, and they'd said, look, I can't afford it. So they don't disagree that the fence is needed or anything like that, or they've got nothing against you or the fence, it's just they can't afford it. So we're going into a negotiation on how much they can contribute. If it's a workplace discussion about returning to office, and an employee might say, I want 2 days to work from home and 3 days in the office. And their employer might agree, but say, look, I think we need a different ratio. So again, we're just negotiating over the task or the resources. Finally, if you're talking to a friend and you have differing views about vaccination, and you might be the pro-vaccination person and they're not vaccinated, they might say to you, look, I just haven't had the time to get vaccinated. So it's simply a question of time management and resource management. But let's flip that over and say, what if these conflicts turned out to be relationship issues? Then when I start talking to my neighbour about the fence, if they start saying things like, you annoyed me, that's why I'm not going to sign this contract to replace the fence because you've been a terrible neighbour and this is payback now. Then it's no longer a question about resources, it's a question about how me and my neighbour relate to each other. If I speak to my boss about wanting to spend more time now working from home because I'm used to that, but the boss doesn't actually trust you, doesn't believe that you'll be spending time, and they might not say this to you directly, this statement, but there might be some subtext around this, that I don't trust you spending your time at home working, I don't think you'll do that. Then it's more a relationship issue than a task-based. And finally, if I speak to my friend about getting vaccinated and they're saying, well, look, I just don't like being nagged, then it might be a more personal thing rather than a time issue. Finally, the discussion have a value-based layer. So if my neighbour objects to fences per se because we live in a nice leafy suburb and fences create barriers, then it's more of a value-based. It's how they see themselves in the world. So it's no longer me versus them, but it's them versus the world. And it's the same when you had this discussion in the workplace about when people start talking about the values of capital versus labour, about whether there should be more family-orientated workforce. And finally, if you're having that discussion with your friend about vaccination and the conversation takes a turn towards, it's about rights and freedoms, and it might be, the right for people to make a decision about getting vaccinated versus the right of society to protect itself against disease, then we're getting into a values-based discussion. And this is important because when we move to the next slide, you see that we've got different aims when we're trying to resolve this. If we know it's just a task and resource-based, then what we're trying to do is just trying to get a compromise. We're just trying to find the happy medium between what we each want. But if it's a relationship-based discussion, then what we're really trying to do, what we really need to do if we want to move forward, is to find some way to heal the relationship, to find that connection. So that's what we're aiming to do in order to move forward. But if it's a values-based discussion, we're not going to find a resolution between the two values. So what it's there is about then is about trying to find a mutual understanding and respect for each person's point of view and to see if there is a way in between those two. So a lot of this is about having a different perspective. So Sarah, I might get you to chat to this next slide here.
Yeah, certainly, David. So first, we'll just ask people if you'd like to type in the chat, what do you see there in that slide that's up there now? What can you see? And Alicia might let us know what's coming through in the chat. A horse.
Everyone's saying horse.
So we're pretty confident it's a horse there. And someone says they can see a horse and a frog. And someone says ambiguous, can't say that word. Yeah, frog and a horse. So I guess most people, when they look at that slide, certainly initially probably see a horse. But you can also view it another way, Alicia, if you'd like to go to the next slide. Yeah, so you can also see the frog. I think probably now most people can see the frog, even if you couldn't see it before. It's not an intelligence test, by the way. Lots of people see different things, so don't panic. But that's a very simple illustration, I guess, that depending on which angle you look at it from, you may see one or the other, and you may see one more strongly than the other. Once you start talking to a party that you've got a difficult issue to discuss with, it is pretty important to try and understand what they're seeing and for them to understand what you're seeing. Because if you're talking about completely different things, you may never be able to reach some sort of resolution of the matter. Now, it doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with what they see, but you do need to understand it, and the same for them. The picture here is just in relation, I suppose, to how you look at the picture, but you've also got to think about our perceptions are affected also by our experiences and our emotions and our history. So, for example, if you see some children out in the backyard playing, depending on your experience and your situation at the time, you might look at the children and go, gosh, that's very noisy, that's very annoying. You know, I moved here for some peace and quiet. Why don't their parents get out there and tell them to calm down and stop annoying the neighbours? Another neighbour might look at it and go, gosh, they sound very loud. You know, I've had quite a traumatic past. So I'm feeling quite stressed. You know, I feel this is aggressive. I'm a bit worried, you know, are they going to start doing things? If they're going to come over the fence and damage my property, I'm pretty worried about this. And you might have a third neighbour who looks over and goes, gee, isn't that lovely? The kids are having fun. What a lovely sight to see young kids out there playing. So again, the experience and your emotional state at the time can play into this. And it is therefore important in having a difficult discussion to try and see what the other person's seeing and for you to explain what you're seeing, because that will help you try and move forward from there. The key, I guess, is to be asking questions and to be compassionate and curious, just trying to understand. You don't have to agree with them, but you do need to get an idea of what they're seeing, and the same for you.
Yeah, and what I love about this image here is, yeah, you've got the same information, but different people can see two different things. The important thing is that there's no right or wrong. You might see a horse more strongly than a frog, or a frog more strongly than a horse. And when we apply this to the difficult conversation, it's not about your view is right, or my view is right and your view is wrong. So when you are talking to somebody who you might have, you know that you're going to not see eye to eye on this kind of thing, is you'd ask, what do you see? And they would tell you what they see. And then you can ask them, do you know what I see? So rather than saying you're right and you're wrong, it's about inviting each person to understand the other person's perspective. And particularly for a values-based discussion, it's really important that you, in order to move forward, that each person can at least see the other person's point of view, even if their view is more strong in their own mind. So there are 5 things we find are key when it comes to helping people resolve disputes, difficult conversations in mediation. One is to create an environment where there's acknowledgement, where each person will acknowledge, don't have to agree, but I can see where you're coming from. I can see why you acted that way. I can see what your, how you interpreted that situation, even if I see it differently. And each person has to acknowledge the other person. The second thing you need if you want to move forward is to have affiliation, a feeling of connection. So that's often reminding people exactly why it is that we are talking to each other. Is it because, you know, we're in the same workplace and we need to work together as a team? We live in the same neighbourhood. We've been friends for 20 years. And with that then comes respect, because in a relationship, if you want to have a positive relationship, nobody wants to be talked down to. So even if you don't agree with the other person's point of view, you don't want to disrespect them or their point of view. You simply say, I don't agree with you, or I don't agree with your point of view. Then, in trying to find a way forward, people need to feel included and need to feel autonomy. So in a mediation, the mediator doesn't make a decision. The mediator invites the parties, the people who are in the dispute, to come up with different options, and together they choose about what is going to be the best way to resolve the dispute. When you're having a difficult conversation, it's a similar thing that you need to keep in mind, which is, I can't tell you what to think. I can't make you think. I can only put the option out there for you to take. I can invite you to look at some options. And then you decide if you're going to pick up some of those points that I've given you. So how does this work in practice? Might go to our next slide. The big thing always is preparation is key. So Anita, what are some of the things we need to think about when you're preparing for a challenging conversation?
Well, I think the first thing that you've got to decide is to talk or not to talk, to have the conversation or not. Sometimes they need to be had, and other times actually you can let them go. And there's no real simple rule for deciding, but I think it's important and it's a good idea to think and reflect. Talk it over with someone. That's always a good idea. And think about, what is the relationship? Is it important? Does the topic matter? And based on what you know about this person and your relationship, what can I realistically hope to achieve by having this conversation? So, is the concern big enough to warrant the risk of having it? Is it an isolated event? Is it a reoccurring problem, or will it resolve itself? And does something need to happen? If the fence is falling down, or there's a noise issue, or do you need to clear the air with that work colleague so that you can work productively together? So it's about, reflecting on that and deciding whether to have it or not, and making a strategic choice.
Yeah, and I guess the risk is too, we're talking before about risk with conversation, that if you wait till a crisis point happens, then you're not going to be prepared, and suddenly the conversation can raise up and you're not as prepared.
Exactly.
So Sara, what would I do then to get in my mind thinking, okay, I've made the decision to have this conversation. What else do I need to sort of think about?
So the next step would then be thinking about, okay, what do I actually want to achieve out of this? What are my expectations? What do I think is achievable in this discussion? So you almost need to have a bit of a think about, look, what's my best outcome from this? What's my worst outcome from this? What are the sort of parameters that I'm looking between? Am I seeking to get an understanding of where they're at? Do I not understand what's gone on and why they've done something or not done something? Am I trying to get some information to understand that? Am I actually looking for them to acknowledge my position? Sometimes the actual outcome isn't as important for people as having their position acknowledged and their concerns acknowledged. So having a think about, is that the case for me in this situation? Are we looking to try and negotiate something? Is there a need to compromise because the positions both of us have cannot both occur, and we therefore need to find a way that there's an outcome that's not perfect, but at least livable for both of us? Are we looking for some sort of behaviour change? So, for example, thinking about the realistic outcomes, if you're having a discussion with your sister and one of you has very strong views on not being vaccinated and yours are the opposite, is that likely to change? Because it might be going back to a values-based discussion, perhaps not. But do we need to at least reach some sort of agreement such as, look, this discussion, this debate going on is really stressing out our elderly mum. So can we at least agree that we'll somehow manage Christmas Day to make it a pleasant day for her? So we need looking at, are we looking for some behaviour change to try and come out of the discussion?
Right. I mean, because these are big conversations and you might not get everything that you want out of the one conversation. You might just, if you can just get in the first bite of the cherry, you might just get a better idea of where they're coming from, and that'll give you an idea of how to tackle the next conversation. And then if you can get them to maybe hear some of the things you want to say, then plant some seeds, then that will help you in the next conversation to go somewhere. What other considerations are, Anita? Like, what are some of the practicalities you'd want to think about before you launched into a discussion like this?
Look, before I go into that, I just want to reiterate that it is really tempting to have a conversation immediately. There's no better time like the present, right? No?
Yeah.
Well, not quite. You know, when we're talking about a difficult situation, it's really important that you decide, you know, have that reflective period and really prepare yourself if you can. You know, and taking time to prepare will help you remain calm, increase the chances that the conversation will go smoothly and improve the ultimate solution. So, look, the logistics, where and when, okay? Have a think about whether it'll be a phone call, online or face-to-face. Look, if it's face-to-face, I would encourage you to have a think about offering a suitable meeting place. It could be a neutral venue like a cafe, and you could have a cup of coffee, or it could actually be taking a walk together.
Yeah, actually, I've seen an ad where, you know, they parody the coffee moment, but because it's such a cliche, but yet there's some really good things about the coffee moment in terms of it's not threatening, it's short, we can go somewhere that's nice and pleasant, and if it turns out to be a deeper conversation, we can buy a second coffee.
Definitely. And of course, you know, if you're a bit fearful, perhaps that could get quite emotional, if you're in a public place, you might feel a bit a bit safer or whatever. Yeah. I would say, allow enough time. Also, you're better off having a bit more time than not enough. It's and gather all your information. You would look at facts and figures, you'd get quotes if it's a fencing issue. If it's a workplace issue, you'd look at the policies that your workplace perhaps has around that particular issue. You might, if it's a noise issue, you might contact council and find out what the regulations or the bylaws are around that, and just have information there in case you need to put it across to the other person. And I think it was mentioned before, questions, you know, questions are really important. People feel cared about and listened to, and it's a way of connecting and respecting, showing your respect to the other person. You know, have a really think about what questions you will ask and how you'll ask them. And I suppose really listen. That's really important. And I think Sara mentioned before something about triggers. It is important to identify what your potential triggers could be and how you could manage those. And we all have strategies that we use to keep ourselves calm. And a part of that, I think, you know, we're not saying that your anger or your hurt or your frustration is to be suppressed or it's, you know, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, the way you're feeling, and also find a way of managing that. Maybe you talk it through, you write it down, I don't know, you go for a jog. So venting it in a way that you're not going to do it when you're meeting with that person. Another thing is that I think we think is quite important is what's your plan B? What if they're not up for it? You know, I would say give them time to think about it. Always leave the door open for them. It might not be the right time. Who knows what's going on in their life at that moment. So don't make those assumptions. They could have other priorities going on. Also, have a think about, we are meeting. Think about what an exit strategy, okay? If something, doesn't go the way you want it to, will you change the subject? Will you suggest another meeting or some time out? Will you walk away? So have a think about the possible different scenarios. And if you're really stuck and it just hasn't gone well, you can contact me if you live in the city of Yarra, and I can talk to you about what's gone on, or you can contact Sara or David at the Dispute Settlement Centre. Yeah. And I suppose an important bit of it is once you've thought through everything, you would invite them to meet with you, but also make sure that, there's an option for a no there.
Yeah, the last thing people want to do is have an ambush. I mean, that's going to just defeat the whole thing if they feel that, because you've done all the preparation, you've thought about your triggers, you've got your questions, you've got your facts and figures, and they might be going, I thought we were just going to have a cup of coffee.
Exactly. And, at this stage, I don't know, but people might be wondering, oh, my goodness, do I need to do all this before one conversation? And while it does take time, it does get easier with each one you do, there is a huge payoff for yourself.
That's right. It's the 80-20 rule, isn't it? That, 20% of the things you do take 80% of the effort.
Exactly.
So once we've got into it, Sara, what are some of the things that you need to think about? So we've managed to get our friend or colleague into the cafe, the coffee machine's running. What do we do?
Yeah, I suppose this is where the 5 factors you mentioned, David, really come into their own. So acknowledgement, respect, affiliation, inclusion, and autonomy. So if you keep those in mind as you're having the discussion, you're probably going to have the better outcome. So starting off, obviously, just showing respect for the other person by, greeting them. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating. Don't have to use a lot of words, and depending on how time poor and how to the point the other person is, you might adapt what you're going to say, but it is at least useful to acknowledge that they've agreed to do this and to participate in the discussion. You might look at also setting some ground rules in a very gentle way. So just perhaps say to them, look, what I'm hoping we can do is that if, you can talk to me and give me an understanding of where you're coming from and what the issues are for you and how you see things. And then I would ask that you let me do the same. So have that reciprocity where you're each having a turn and each getting the chance to explore each other's perspective and see how that goes from there. You might also obviously start, David mentioned before, about an ambush. So probably the best opening line is not, why on earth did you do this? That was a really stupid thing to do, or something along those lines. It might be, look, I'm just a bit puzzled. So this seems to have happened. Can you just get me to understand, what was going on there? I just, trying to understand that. It wasn't what I was expecting. So you can put it in a very nice way, but you're asking to, again, get their perspective on it, but not greeting them with a line which is immediately going to get their back up and them coming out fighting, or perhaps even deciding the conversation is now off.
I think we often talk about, using open questions, but, and as we're saying about prepare yourself, because some even open questions can come out a bit passive aggressive. So if you go like, what were you thinking? Or why did you do that? There's an element of kind of judgment there too, but it's more about seeking to sort of asking questions to respond rather than. Yeah,
it's that sort of curious questions. Look, I'm just standing, I'm not standing across from you arguing with you, I'm standing next to you, just trying to see your perspective. So what was the thinking behind that? I'm just trying to get, doesn't mean I agree, but I need to understand that so I can then decide from there, what I need to do and what you might need to do and how we might work this out together. Listening is obviously very important. It is a conversation, so both parties need to have a turn, but it is important as the other person's speaking to try and concentrate on what they're saying and try and see how it looks for them, rather than worrying about how you're going to respond point by point. In terms of asking questions, as David said, open questions. Why did that happen? How did that come about? What were you, thinking along those lines? it's not a cross-examination. Did you do this on the 12th of December? Did you, do that because you blah, blah, blah? It is very important. It is that very open question, asking for information rather than narrowing them down into a corner. I guess another thing to think about is also body language and position. So it's something, body language is quite often something we do think about, I guess. In Western society, making eye contact is quite important. It shows that you're paying attention. For some people, though, depending on their level of shyness or their cultural background, it might actually be really intimidating. So almost thinking about sitting at a, David said yesterday, 45-degree angle, you can make contact when necessary, but they can talk without necessarily feeling they're under the spotlight. So have a think about that. If you're a very tall person talking to a very short person and you're standing up, that can feel quite intimidating. So, we had an experience where someone was very concerned for their safety, very elderly, short lady, and the neighbours next door, who were young male basketballers, very tall, came over one dark night to talk to them, felt very intimidated by these big people on their front doorstep, and they were like, hang on, I just went over to have a chat, but it's how it appears to the other person. So have a think about that sort of body language. And as you're saying to people, tell me all about it. I really want to hear your view. If you're playing with your mobile phone or doing something else, they're going to be pretty sure you're not actually that interested. So really have a think about how that looks. I guess the best rule is, what would you like them to do as you're talking to them? Think about how that would play out for them. The other thing I would say is don't be scared of showing vulnerability or even apologising if it's appropriate. Quite often doing that will actually encourage them to show the same sort of behaviour back. So Anita mentioned before about vulnerability. It is a difficult thing for us to do, but it can be quite powerful if you're having a genuine discussion.
So there's a lot about there. I think the first thing is seek to understand before you seek to be understood, which is, I think, Stephen Covey comes up with that in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, is to say, look, I want to hear what your views are on this, and then you invite them to say, do you want to hear what I think as well? So then they ask you, I'd like to hear, or you might say, well, what do you think my views are on this? Because you might have had this discussion already, and then you can clarify things as you go along. So what happens, Anita, if you end up, you can see this is a clash of values kind of discussion?
Well, look, I think it's really important that you don't try to persuade them. It's not going to be resolved by you telling them that they're wrong or here are the facts. Okay?
You're not going to win the debate, even if you lose.
No.
Even if your arguments are better, you're not going to win the debate.
No, our values and beliefs are quite, and actually there's research which suggests the more you do that, the more people will dig their heels in. And yeah, so definitely don't do that. And we've said it over and over again, it's listening and asking questions as to why perhaps they hold those beliefs, and try to get an understanding of that. Really important too, even though you might your values and beliefs might be just totally different, you can find commonalities and build on these. The more you talk and the more questions you ask, you will find, you might be able to say something around, if it's to do with vaccination, yes, we're all concerned about what we inject into our bodies. Or if it's a workplace thing with your body, yes, we all want our team to perform really well and achieve its goals. So listen out for those commonalities and repeat them, and that really actually, it's the connection you're building with the other person. And, often, even though you've got someone's got totally differing values and beliefs from you, they probably will say some truths. There'll be truths in their argument. So just make sure, to validate those. And look, if the conversation does get emotional, remember that your response can influence their behaviour, okay? So it's not easy to do, but the more you do it, the more practice you do, the better you're at. You can actually, research tells us that we tend to mirror those around us. So don't mirror them, okay? You can de-escalate, change the atmosphere in the conversation by responding to anger with empathy and using a concerned, empathetic tone of voice. What we do is it's called EAR, E-A-R, and that stands for empathy, attention and respect. It's quite easy to remember. So you may say something like, oh, I really understand your frustration. I want to know what your concerns are. And I really respect your passion on this. And if you do that, it can really help the situation.
Yeah. I noticed when you did those two sentences, you didn't use a but in between. So
no.
I acknowledge what you're saying, but I've got a different point of view, and that can often, when they put the but in, that sometimes sort of negates what the good work that you've just done, doesn't it?
Totally. Try and use and, like you wouldn't be saying, yeah, okay, you've got a really good point there, but
It's completely wrong.
So that you've really got a good point, sort of doesn't exist anymore, that what you've said. So, whereas if you say and or other phrases to join the two,
similar. If you put in an apology, I'm really sorry this happened, but you were really annoying me. Translate definitely. As you were really annoying me.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we've made some progress in our discussion, Sarah. How do we turn like the positives into some kind of result?
Yep. So I guess the first thing is I would be trying to summarise what each of you has said, and it might be down to one sentence. So it sounds like from your point of view, in relation to doing something about this fence, that your biggest concern is about cost. And so what, as you will have heard, my concern is about the appearance. So again, very, very simple summary, but just trying to summarise it. It's showing them that you have paid attention, you have taken into account what they've said. You would then check for confirmation. So you would be saying something like, okay, so I think what I'm getting out of this is that what we might be able to do together is, A, B, and C, and get them to say yes, no, or whatever. So really check that if you think there's an understanding that is right. There's nothing worse than if each of you walks away thinking you had an understanding and it turns out you were still talking about completely different things. So at the risk of finding out there isn't an agreement, it is important that you find that out now. You would also look at, okay, if there is some sort of agreement, who's going to do what? So be a bit specific. So, who's going to get the quotes, who's going to contact the council, who's going to do this? Because again, those little misunderstandings after you think you've reached agreement will actually probably do more damage than was originally there. Also have a look at the reciprocity of the situation. So what are each of you going to contribute? And sometimes you might get someone who says, look, I'll do all of this. I'll do A, B, C, D, E, and G. But then you say to them, well, look, that's great. You're going to do all this stuff. What do you want me to do? Because I want you to know that I'm contributing as well. Here are some things I think I could do to help. What can we do? So again, look at it from the point of view, if it's looking very one-sided, it's probably not going to be as long-lasting an agreement as if each of you have contributed to the solution and the actions that are going to take place. I'd also look at, do you need to have a further discussion? So in some cases, there might be a few steps and then you need to have some more discussions. Even if you think everything's sorted, what's the fallback if something goes wrong? So you've each decided to go and get quotes for the fence in the next 2 weeks. What if no one can do that because the fences are too busy? So what's the fallback position in terms of any further communication needed? Because you've got a bit of goodwill going at this stage, try and work out those sort of details. Also, obviously, be polite and thank them for opening up and discussing things with you. and giving them, again, it's that respect and showing them that you've paid attention. A question had popped up in the chat as well, just from Catherine, about what do you do if the other person doesn't want to hear your views? And I guess for that, I'd go back to the start with the ground rules and say, look, if you've set the ground rules and you've got agreement that each of you is going to have a turn, I'd refer back to that. At the end of the day, if you're still not getting anywhere, it might be you go back to your plan B and have to have a conversation later. Let them have a think about what's happened so far, and you have a think and then try again later.
Yeah, and I think too, we go back about managing your expectations. So the first thing is to understand their views. The second is to try and build enough trust, if you've listened to them, that they'll reciprocate and create the opportunity. So yeah, there's a bit that we're talking about. There's a risk. There's a risk that you engage in this conversation and that you listen respectfully and politely to them, and they won't then want to be interested in what you want to hear. And I guess that's where we think about go back to the connection.
Definitely.
Another thing, and I was thinking about when we talk about concluding this, is looking at those three layers. What is your aim in this particular conflict? So if it's just a task or resource kind of thing, then yeah, you'll probably get a nice balance about, well, I'll give you 2 days of working in the office if you give me 3 days working at home, or whatever it is. But if it's a relationship, you might think, well, if to get a valid or useful outcome to this, what I've really got to think is what can we do to build the relationship? So we might be thinking not so much about at this stage about getting that compromise, but we'll be thinking, what can I do to help build trust? What can we do in our workplace to have a better opportunity? And it might be, we have an experiment where we go, give me a task, I'll do it from home, and I can prove to you that you can trust me doing this. So it's important, I think, when you look at the conclusion of your discussion, you think about the aims. What was I trying to achieve here? Have we got at least a mutual understanding, mutual respect on each other's views? And then, maybe it would be also good to get some kind of plan to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why we do what we do, because unfortunately there are, a tiny minority of the population that aren't able to have those difficult conversations and do require a neutral third person to come in and provide a process to have those where people then can hear your views.
Yeah, and I guess, look, we went back to the just thinking about the original title of the topic, to talk or not to talk. And sometimes the other person's not prepared to hear your views at all. Then maybe, yeah, that's not the time to talk, and you've got to let things simmer, because there could be various reasons why they don't want to hear your view. So they could still be, as I said, it's a relationship issue. They're still really angry at you. So no matter what you do to have the conversation, they're not going to actually be in a mood to listen because of what's happened. Okay.
Sometimes you might actually need to call that out again in a polite but respectful way, and just say, look, I feel that I've listened, as you've been speaking, and I've heard you say A, B, and C. So again, a chance to summarise and reflect back what they've said. But a couple of times I've tried to say something and it feels to me as if I'm not able to finish. I just want to understand what's happening here. So, it may even be necessary to call it out in a sort of respectful way and just try and see what the issue is.
Yeah, actually, sometimes that's why I suggested the trick too, about asking, what do you think my views are, my feelings are on this? Because you're asking them, then they're still giving their opinion of your views, and then you've got something to discuss with them. Well, it's interesting that you feel that you thought, it's interesting you thought that I was angry and upset about this, or that you think that I'm actually a fascist controlling person, because I don't see it quite that way. Use that word, but. So that's at least, a way to engage in a discussion about your thoughts and views, is to invite them to have a reflection on it.
Definitely.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Catherine, again, can agreeing to disagree and not talk about a point of contention to maintain a relationship as a way forward?
Yes.
Definitely.
In a word?
Of course, yeah. There are things that we don't discuss at my family gatherings.
I guess it depends how important the point is, doesn't it really? So, for example, if you're having the discussion about return to work 3 days or not with your boss, there probably needs to be a conclusion to that in some way, even if it's a temporary one. Well, why don't we try it for 3 months and then can we review it and see what we're thinking? But, you know, some, again, the values-based type ones, you may not be able to agree, and you may be able to get on. You know, obviously we all work with people who have different values from us, and we manage to do that, and that's not an issue. So again, what was the actual point of it? It was a way to manage it. Is it something that is so core to the relationship that we need to deal with it? Yeah, such as conspiracy theories and otherwise with pandemics. So. I mean, sometimes people may have views that each of us considers is very extreme. I guess in that situation, you can think about, well, I'm probably not going to change their views, but what can I achieve from this? So, you know, if my neighbour is someone who I think just, you know, isn't in touch with reality, is there something we can still agree on? Some simple rules like they won't come over and not bang on my door after 9 o'clock at night, or, you know, something that'll make life at least easier for both of us.
Yeah. Can I just pick up, because there's a question here about having in the middle of 2 different versions of events. And I think going back to that other question about agreeing to disagree, this often happens in mediation where 2 people have different versions of what happened in an event. And it's useful to have that discussion to try and understand what each person thought happened. And then we have to agree to disagree on the facts. But what we can move forward into is the opinions and the points of view that were generated from what each person interpreted from that event. So we might have, just to use a simplified example of the fence dispute, where person A comes and says, you know, you handed me the notice to fence and you were very angry. And the other person says, that's not how I felt. That's not my emotional state. So we might have to agree to disagree on that. But what we move forward in is an agreement on what we have to do about the fence.
So I was just going to say, I think you did touch on this a little bit in that answer, David, but there is another question: how to say I don't agree or I won't do this in a respectful way.
Who will take that? So, Sarah?
I guess, again, the first thing would be reflecting back what you've heard them say, so that they really do understand that you're not just saying this, but you have taken into account and really considered what they've said. By doing that, at least you are showing respect for the fact that they've spent time, you know, communicating to you and you have heard them. That would be the very first step that I would take in that situation. And then I would try and explain why it is for me that, although I've heard what they've had to say, what they're proposing is not going to work for me.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'd also ask, you know, well, look, are there any other options you can think about? Okay, that's one. Okay, yep. Let's have a think about what else there could be.
Yeah, and I think going back to Sarah's point too about that, it's about ownership and saying, you know, I don't feel comfortable. So not you're wrong, but it's and this is where you're sort of setting, I guess, appropriate boundaries by saying, you know, I don't feel that I'm able to do that, rather than you're wrong in telling me that, or I'm blaming you for putting me in that situation, but rather this is what I feel I need for me. So that's that I statement kind of stuff.
I'd be asking also, David, why, you know, what are the reasons for that option? You know, because trying to get to the underlying needs, because they might put forward a certain option, but in actual fact, there are certain needs there that can be met in other ways, not just that one option. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So, it might be that I can see that you want to achieve this and I want to achieve this, and this option is not going to work for that. So let's keep looking at other ideas.
Definitely, definitely.
And the other thing is, I suppose, in some cases, once you've done all of this, it might be that what you actually need is a determination where some outside person who's not interested for one person or the other actually makes a decision. Sometimes, you know, that is a way you might actually agree that's what you need.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. And yeah, exactly.
Don't invite Cousin Barry to Christmas. That'll solve our problem. No, I don't.
I was just going to say, I think we're right on 1 p.m. So I think we will wrap it up there. David, is there anything else you wanted to add, or Sara or Anita, before we log off?
No, but I think we've put some useful links on the slides and we've put them in the chat.
Could I say, if you live in the city of Yarra, please do call me, even if you just want to have a chat about a situation or refer a client or whatever. It doesn't need to go to a formal process. It can be around just talking things through with me. So definitely I'm there for that.
Yeah. And I just saw there's somebody in the comments said these sessions need to be part of a school curriculum. And while we can't go that far, we are available if you have a group who would like us to expand a bit further and talk to a session, then our contact details are here on the screen.
And I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning in and for the great questions and comments, and also to Alicia, who there in the background has done such a good job with the slides and the tech and so forth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone. And as I mentioned in the chat, I will follow up with an email that'll include the slides from today and the contact details for our panelists if you need them. Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.